So there I was, standing in my massive kitchen, holding a piece of toast that looked like it had survived a house fire. Smoke was swirling up to the ceiling, the stupid fire alarm was screeching, and I just froze. Not because I was shocked, but because I was so done. Like, how hard is it to make toast? But no, I'd managed to mess even that up. And as I stood there in my empty kitchen, in this huge house that felt more like a museum than a home, it hit me. I couldn't remember the last time I actually cooked something. Edward used to do the cooking. He'd hum some Sinatra, toss around spices like he was a chef on TV, and dinner would just appear. But Edward's been gone for 5 years now. And me? Well, I've been living off takeout containers and frozen meals that taste like cardboard. The thing is, I didn't really notice how bad it had gotten until I retired last year. When I was working at the law firm, I was busy, too busy to care. But now, it's just me. Me and my silence. And let me tell you, silence gets loud after a while. That's when I thought, I need help. Not just with the cooking, though clearly I could use it, but with, well, life. Just as I was thinking about how much I needed help, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I shuffled over, wiping my hands on a kitchen towel. When I opened the door, my jaw nearly hit the floor. Standing there was a whole team of firefighters, helmets, uniforms, the works. Can I help you?" I asked, blinking at them like they were aliens. The guy in the front, this tall, broad-shouldered type with a kind smile, spoke up. "Ma'am, someone in your neighborhood called about smoke. We were nearby, so we came to check it out." Smoke. Oh right, the toast. I let out this awkward laugh. Oh no, there's no fire. It's just me being a terrible cook. I mean, honestly, I could burn water if I tried hard enough. The guy cracked a grin. "Well, that's a relief. But are you sure everything's okay?" Yeah, I'm fine. It's just, I've never really done much cooking. My husband used to handle all that, and now, well, he's gone, and it's just me. I used to work in law, big law firm, lots of hours, no time to learn how to cook. And now I've got all the time in the world and no clue what I'm doing. I didn't mean to unload on him, but the words just came tumbling out, and instead of brushing me off, he actually listened. He stood there on my porch, helmet tucked under one arm, nodding like he really cared. It felt good talking to someone, a real human, not the delivery guy or a cashier or my daughter through a phone screen. Just a person standing in front of me. Listening. "Well," he said after a moment, "if you ever need anything, you've got our station number. Don't hesitate to call, even if it's just for burnt toast." I laughed at that, a real laugh, and thanked him. As they headed back to their truck, I closed the door and leaned against it. After they left, I stood there for a moment, staring at the door like it might open again. The house felt so quiet, so still, the kind of quiet that almost has weight to it, pressing down on your chest. That's when it hit me. I didn't have to live like this. I mean, here I was, rattling around in this giant house all by myself. I had the means to afford some help. Why hadn't I thought of this sooner? It wasn't like I hadn't tried to fix the loneliness. My daughter, Scarlett, has told me 100 times, "Mom, why don't you just move to San Francisco, or let me come live with you for a while?" But Scarlett's job keeps her tied down there. She works crazy hours and shares a small rented place with her boyfriend. "It's just not practical," she says every time I bring it up, her voice full of that same guilt I feel every time I hear it. She's a good daughter, though. She calls me almost every day, always asking if I'm eating well, if I'm staying active. But no matter how much we talk, it doesn't fill the emptiness of this house. That's when I realized I didn't need Scarlett to uproot her life. I didn't need to move to San Francisco. What I needed was someone here, in this house. Someone who could handle the day-to-day stuff I was so terrible at. Someone who could cook a decent meal and maybe, just maybe, sit down for a cup of coffee and conversation now and then. I decided right then and there I was going to hire a butler or a cook or, I don't know, just someone. Someone who could make this house feel less like a museum and more like a home again. After I decided to take the plunge, I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my laptop, sat down at the kitchen counter, and posted an ad on Craigslist. It was pretty straightforward. I needed someone to help with cooking and light chores, ideally someone who wouldn't mind living in. Feeling oddly productive, I closed the laptop and headed to the library. It's one of my favorite rooms in the house, with walls lined with books I've collected over the years. I grabbed a Raymond Chandler novel and settled into the big leather armchair, letting his words whisk me away. But barely a few pages in, my phone started buzzing. At first, I thought it might be Scarlett checking in, but no. It was a flood of notifications, messages, replies to my ad. I couldn't believe it. In just an hour, I had a handful of applicants, all eager to take the job. It was a little overwhelming, but it also felt good to know so many people were interested. I skimmed through the messages, reading their work experiences and jotting down notes. Then I set up interviews, giving each person a time slot to come by the house. The first one showed up less than an hour later. When I opened the door, there stood a middle-aged woman, dressed sharply in slacks and a blouse. She introduced herself as Monica, and while she had all the right credentials, something about her rubbed me the wrong way. So I started trying to sound casual. What made you interested in this position? She glanced around the entryway, barely looking at me. I've worked for several families in Beverly Hills. They always found my work impeccable. I don't see why this would be any different. I nodded, trying to keep the conversation going. That's great. And how do you handle working in a household where someone's, still adjusting to having help? She gave a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Well, I expect clear instructions. I'm not a mind reader, and I don't tolerate micromanaging. Okay. I forced a polite smile. The conversation went on, but every question I asked seemed to get a curt, almost dismissive response. By the end, I could tell we weren't a good fit. Well, Monica, I said, standing to signal the interview was over. Thank you for coming by. I'll be in touch soon. She nodded, clearly unimpressed, and left without much fanfare. Not exactly off to a great start. The next applicant showed up right on time. When I opened the door, there he was, a Mexican man, maybe in his early 60s, with a warm smile that didn't quite mask the slight unease in his eyes. His name was Javier, and at first he seemed pleasant enough. He told me he'd worked in various homes as a cook and handyman. But as the conversation went on, something felt off. So Javier, I asked, leaning forward slightly, what's your favorite thing to cook? He scratched his chin. I'm good at a lot of things, Señora, but mostly I like to cook whatever pays. It wasn't the words themselves, but the way he said them, like he was playing a role. And when I pressed him about his past work experience, his answers felt vague, almost rehearsed. There was a certain vibe about him, like he was holding something back. By the end of the interview, I knew I couldn't hire him either. Thanks for coming by, Javier. I'll let you know what I decide. He nodded, gave a polite wave, and walked out. As the door closed behind him, I exhaled. 2 interviews down, and I was already questioning this whole idea. By the time I finished interviewing the TH applicant, I was completely drained. Every person who walked through that door seemed to either lack the skills, the personality, or just that gut feeling I was looking for. Some were polite but stiff, others overly chatty, and a few made me wonder how they even thought they'd qualify for this job. It wasn't just about finding someone who could cook or clean. It was about finding someone I could trust, someone who wouldn't make me feel like a stranger in my own home. And that, it seemed, was asking too much. I'm the kind of person who's always been careful about letting people in. Maybe it's because of my years working in law, seeing what people were capable of. Or maybe it's just me. Either way, trusting someone with my home and my life felt impossible. By the time I wrapped up, the sun had set, and I decided to call it a day. I'll deal with this tomorrow, I told myself, closing my laptop and heading upstairs to my bedroom. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, frustration gave way to doubt. Maybe this was a stupid idea. Maybe I didn't need anyone in my space, messing with my routines. Maybe I was better off alone. Then the loneliness crept in, soft at first, then all at once. The kind of loneliness that wraps itself around you, pressing into every corner of your mind. I started thinking about Edward, about the nights we spent in this very bed, whispering, laughing, and sharing dreams. The way his arm would drape over me, his warmth making everything else melt away. Now the bed felt cold, too big, too empty. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly, my chest tightening with a familiar ache. Is this it? I whispered to the darkness. Is this all there is? All the life I've lived? Is this all it adds up to? It felt too soon, too sudden, like I'd blinked and ended up here, alone in a house that used to be so full of life. I sighed, turning onto my side and clutching the extra pillow. As the night dragged on, I found myself restless, my mind racing. I slipped my hand under the covers. It had been a long time since I'd felt anything other than sadness and loneliness, and it was surprising how much I missed this. I thought of Edward, his hands on me, the way he knew me. My breath grew shallower as the memories bringing warmth to me, but even as I lay there, I knew it was only a temporary escape. The emptiness was still there, waiting for me to face it again. But for now, I had the quiet of the night, the memory of Edward, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, tomorrow would be the day that changed everything. The next morning, I decided to clear my head by tending to the garden. There's something therapeutic about getting your hands dirty, pulling weeds and trimming hedges. But even as I worked, my mind kept wandering, replaying the doubts and loneliness that had weighed on me the night before. That's when I saw him. He was walking down the street, his broad shoulders and lean physique unmistakable, even in his worn-out clothes. His messy but handsome hair fell just right over his forehead, and his green eyes seemed to carry a quiet depth. There was something about him, an air of mystery maybe. He didn't look like he belonged here, and yet he fit in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on. Before I knew it, I was walking toward him, my gaze fixed, my mouth slightly open. "Excuse me, ma'am. Watch out, be careful." His voice snapped me out of my trance. I blinked, realizing I'd nearly stumbled off the pavement. My cheeks flushed as I noticed he was holding my arm, steadying me. He had a cute accent, soft, warm, and unfamiliar. "Oh, I'm so sorry," I blurted out, flustered. I wasn't paying attention. I was, looking at that tree. A little white lie, because there was no way I could admit the truth, that his sheer presence had completely derailed me. He smiled, and it was like the world tilted just a little. "No problem. Just glad you didn't fall." I pulled myself together and introduced myself. "I'm Camilla, by the way." "Hakan," he replied, and the name hung in the air like a melody. "Hakan," I repeated, the syllables rolling off my tongue. "That's an unusual name." He nodded, the smile lingering on his lips. "I'm from Turkey. I came here to study bioengineering at Caltech." "Turkey?" I asked, surprised. "That's a long way from here." He nodded again, his expression softening. "Yes, it's been an adjustment." I couldn't help but notice the faint worry lines on his face. "You seem a little disheveled," I said, trying to sound casual. Hakan let out a small laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's nothing. I've only been in America for a month, and I'm still figuring things out. Right now, I'm staying at a friend's place. His basement, actually. It's temporary, but..." He trailed off, shrugging. Something about his honesty and the way he carried himself tugged at me. Before I could second-guess myself, the words were already out of my mouth. "Would you like to come in for a drink?" He looked surprised, but nodded politely. "That would be nice, thank you." Hakan followed me into the house, his movements a little hesitant, like he wasn't sure where to step. He stood there in the hallway, shifting slightly on his feet, his hands brushing the sides of his worn jeans. I couldn't help but smile at his shyness. "Don't be shy," I said playfully, closing the door behind us. "I don't bite." He chuckled softly, his eyes darting around as if he was trying to figure out what to do next. "Come on," I said, gesturing toward the living room. "Make yourself comfortable." He nodded, his politeness showing in the way he moved. He sat down on the couch, his posture straight and formal, like he didn't want to sink into the cushions too much. I went into the kitchen, quickly making 2 cups of coffee. When I returned, I handed him a cup and took a seat across from him. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice sincere. "Camilla," I corrected, smiling. "You don't need to call me ma'am. It makes me feel ancient." He laughed, relaxing a little, and took a sip of his coffee. So I began setting my cup down on the table. "You're new to the States, trying to figure things out, huh?" He nodded. "Yes, it's been challenging. Everything here is so different. I'm grateful my friend let me stay in his basement, but it's not ideal." I nodded, sensing the quiet weight of his words, and then almost on impulse, I said it. "It's like we both need each other." He looked at me, surprised, his brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "I mean, I need someone to help me around here, someone to cook, handle small chores, and just keep me company. And you're looking for a place to stay, right? So why not stay here?" His eyes widened slightly, and he sat back, processing what I just said. "You're serious?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Dead serious," I replied. "You'd live here, help out, and I'd even pay you. It's a win-win." For a moment he just looked at me, his green eyes searching mine. Then I saw the hint of a smile creeping across his face. "No, no, please," he said, shaking his head quickly. "You don't need to pay me a penny. I would be happy to help you, ma'am. I mean, Camilla." I smiled, the warmth of his response making me feel something I hadn't felt in a long time, genuine excitement. "And," he added, his voice picking up enthusiasm, "I know how to cook. My father is a chef in Turkey. He taught me everything." It felt almost too good to be true. A handsome, intelligent, polite young man who could cook. Someone who could make this big, lonely house feel alive again. It was like a dream come true. "Well," I told him, still firm in my decision, "I'll still pay you, whether you like it or not." He chuckled, clearly grateful but a bit reluctant, like he wasn't used to such kindness. "I promise, Camilla, you don't have to. Feel free to bring your stuff," I said, cutting him off with a smile. About an hour later, he returned with a suitcase in hand, looking like he'd just stepped out of a movie scene. His appreciation was so sincere, so heartwarming, that I almost felt guilty for offering so little in return. "Thank you again, Camilla. I really don't know how to express it," he said, his voice full of gratitude. "It's no problem," I replied, smiling as I showed him to the room I had prepared for him. Later that evening, as the sun began to dip behind the horizon, I found myself feeling unusually hungry. I wasn't used to feeling this way, but then I remembered Hakan was here and he could cook. When I saw him walking out of his room, it was impossible not to notice how good he looked. He was wearing shorts and a tight t-shirt that hugged his ripped muscles just right. His hair was damp from the shower, and there was something intoxicating about the aftershave and cologne he wore. I couldn't help but stare for a moment before I caught myself. "Camilla," he said with a teasing smile. "You're doing it again. You seem distracted." Flustered, I quickly turned my attention back to him. Yes, I was just thinking about what to eat tonight." How could I have told him that I was actually thinking about the rod? "You don't need to worry about that," he said, grinning. "Let me see what we have in the kitchen." I watched him head for the kitchen, feeling oddly at ease in his presence. I couldn't deny it. The guy had a way of making everything seem right. A little while later, he brought a plate of food to the table. The smell was mouth-watering, like nothing I'd ever had before. It was a simple but delicious Turkish dish, menemen, scrambled eggs with tomatoes, peppers, and spices. It tasted heavenly, every bite richer than the last. As we ate, I couldn't help but tease him a little. "You know, Hakan, for someone who just arrived in the country, you sure know how to make a woman feel welcome." He raised an eyebrow, smirking. "I try my best," he said, but his tone was lighter than usual, a little more playful. I leaned in just slightly, lowering my voice. "Well, if this meal is any indication, I think you'll be keeping me very well fed, in more ways than one." Hakan chuckled, the corner of his lips curling upward. "Careful, Camilla, you might just tempt me to stay here forever." I gave him a wink, enjoying the way the conversation was turning. It felt good to have someone around, someone who knew how to make things feel less lonely. After dinner, we moved to the living room, settling in front of the TV to watch Netflix. The atmosphere was easy, relaxed, nothing forced. It felt comforting, almost like we'd been doing this forever. We talked here and there, but as the evening wore on, I could tell Hakan was getting tired. "I think I'm going to hit the sack," he said, stretching his arms above his head. "Of course," I replied, not wanting to keep him up. "Good night, Hakan." He smiled at me and headed off to his room, and just like that, I was left alone again. The silence felt heavier this time. I could still feel the warmth of his presence, lingering in the house like a quiet, almost tangible thing. I sat there, alone on the couch, trying to focus on the TV screen, but my thoughts kept wandering back to him. The way he moved, his voice, that faint scent of cologne that still seemed to hang in the air. It felt strange to be so affected by someone, especially someone so young. 5 years since Edward passed, 5 years of loneliness, of nights spent in a cold, empty bed, and now, here was Hakan, somehow filling the space, making me feel things I hadn't allowed myself to feel in so long. I tried to sleep that night, but I tossed and turned. I couldn't escape the yearning. The next morning, I woke up to a soft knock on my door. I opened it to find Hakan standing there with a warm smile, holding a tray of fresh breakfast. "Morning, Camilla," he said. "I made you breakfast." I took the tray from him, the sight of scrambled eggs, toast, and fresh juice almost making me tear up. It felt so nurturing, so familiar. It reminded me of Edward. A single tear slipped down my cheek before I could stop it. Hakan looked at me, his brow furrowing in concern. "Why are you crying?" I wiped my face quickly, trying to compose myself. "It's just, my husband used to do this for me," I said, my voice catching a little. Hakan stepped closer, his expression softening. Without a word, he wiped the tear away with his thumb. "I'm sorry, Camilla. I didn't mean to make you sad." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "It's just, you remind me of him, that's all." He pulled me into a hug, and for a moment, everything felt right again. The warmth of his embrace, his steady presence. It was all so comforting. Later that day, Hakan went off to school. He was back in about 4 hours, but the house felt empty again. When he came back, something inside me just snapped. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I walked up to him before he could even say anything, and I hugged him tightly. He seemed taken aback, but he didn't pull away. "I don't know what I'd do without you," I said, my voice trembling. "You remind me so much of Edward. I feel so lonely without him. I want you to fill that void, the one he left." Hakan stiffened slightly, not quite sure what to say. "Camilla, you don't need to feel alone. I'm here. I'll always be here for you." But his words didn't quite reach me. He didn't understand. He couldn't. "No," I whispered, pulling back slightly to look at him. "You don't understand. I don't just need someone to be here. I need someone to fill the emptiness he left. I faltered, realizing how ridiculous I probably sounded. How could I ask him to do something like that? I awkwardly steered the conversation elsewhere. "I'm sorry," I said, trying to laugh it off. I don't know what came over me." And then he caught me off guard. In one swift motion, he leaned in and his lips met mine, soft, tentative, as though he was testing the waters. For a split second, I was frozen. But then that spark ignited, burning through me. My hands, almost on their own, reached for him, pulling him closer, desperate to feel the warmth of his body, the energy that he had awakened inside me. When we finally pulled apart, my breath came in shallow gasps, my chest heaving with the intensity of it. I looked into his eyes, and in that fleeting moment, I saw it to the hunger, the desire, the undeniable connection between us. It was like a magnet pulling me toward him with a force I couldn't escape. I kissed him again, this time without hesitation, my lips pressing harder against his, as if I could taste all the years of loneliness and longing I'd kept hidden away. My hands fumbled at the hem of his shirt, pulling it over his head, exposing his toned chest. The sight of him, all lean muscle and smooth skin, took my breath away. Without a word, I led him to my room, the room that still faintly carried the scent of Edward's cologne. I tried to mask it, lighting candles to fill the air with a fragrance that was mine, something fresh, something new. It was a small thing, but it felt like I was finally taking back control, reclaiming a part of myself that had been dormant for so long. But as much as I wanted to lose myself in him, I knew that I needed more. I needed him to take me, to claim me, to make me feel alive again. And then, as if reading my mind, he did something that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in so long. It was like a dam had broken, and I was drowning in it. In that moment, all that mattered was the connection we shared. It was like coming home, like nothing and no one else in the world mattered, like we were exactly where we were meant to be. The night unfolded beautifully. We explored each other like we were discovering new lands, and when we finally lay there, spent and exhausted, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I had found a way to live again.